Mine is Evan Klein, and I am 31 years old. This happened in October of last year, deep in Myakka River State Park, Florida. I remember the exact day we set off, just after lunch on a crisp, rain-washed afternoon. My wife Eleanor and I had been drifting apart for months. We were desperate to rekindle the bond that once kept us close through every storm life threw our way. She was 29, adventurous, sensitive, and altogether the kind of person who could coax me into believing in better days. But lately, every conversation ended in a sigh or a glare. This trip, we'd said, would be a fresh start. The idea came from our good friends, Marge and Daniel, who suggested we take the RV down to the backcountry section of Myakka River State Park for a long weekend of hiking and fishing. Marge, 35, brash and confident, didn't hesitate when I asked if she and Daniel would join. I suspect she saw it as a break from her own restless life. Daniel, at 32, quieter and more methodical, had done the route planning. He'd picked out the perfect remote campsite near the river's edge. An idyllic spot, he called it, far from the main roads and tourist areas. He had read every pamphlet, every trail guide, and was certain this trip would be smooth sailing. But as we rolled in along a narrow dirt path, the RV rattling over exposed roots and patches of loose sand, I sensed something off. Myakka was beautiful. Tall oak trees draped in Spanish moss, muddy banks where alligators lounged in the distance, and a sky so blue it felt like a painting. Yet there was a hush beneath that natural splendor, a watchful quiet, as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. By late afternoon, we'd parked the RV at the chosen clearing. It was more isolated than I expected. No other campers were in sight. Just a rough picnic table and a fire ring half choked with old ash. Eleanor stepped outside first, running a hand through her dark hair and scanning the surroundings. "It's lovely," she said, but her tone was uncertain. Marge hopped out next, hands on hips, taking in the scene. Daniel killed the engine, his brow knit in mild concern as it coughed before shutting off. I started unloading gear while Eleanor unfolded a pair of canvas chairs. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Our generator kicked on with a sputter, providing a hum of electricity. Marge joked about us roughing it, though we had more luxuries than most hardcore campers: lights, a fridge, and a small stovetop. The first night, nothing too bizarre happened, just subtle hints. We heard strange noises drifting through the cypress trees, a distant laughter, high-pitched, like children playing hide-and-seek. It startled me, and I remember glancing at Eleanor. She shrugged, unsure. Maybe there were other campers with kids nearby, though we'd passed no one on the route in. The next morning, I woke just after sunrise and stepped outside to stretch. The ground was damp from a night shower. As I circled around the RV, I froze. On the dusty windows, about shoulder height, were small, muddy handprints. 3 or 4 sets, each print the size of a toddler's palm. They trailed around the vehicle, ending at the main door. I stood there, my stomach sinking, as Eleanor emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw them too, her face going pale. "Did someone come by during the night?" she asked, voice subdued. We hadn't heard footsteps or voices. Marge, yawning at the threshold, glanced at the handprints and shook her head. "This is weird," she said. Daniel knelt to inspect them, pressing his own hand next to the prints for comparison. Far too small. He said nothing, but I caught the unease in his eyes. We tried to rationalize. Maybe a family was playing a prank. Still, the nearest official campsite was miles away. The realization left a bitter taste in my mouth. After breakfast, we decided to explore a nearby trail. Daniel wanted to photograph wildlife. Eleanor and I thought a scenic walk might help our mood, but the tension between us persisted. I asked her which trail she preferred. She sighed and said, "Whichever you want, Evan." Then I got irritated, reading dismissal in her tone. Behind us, Marge rolled her eyes at our bickering, and Daniel pretended not to notice. Out on the trail, things got stranger. The forest felt unnaturally silent except for sudden bursts of noise, like a branch breaking just behind the next tree, or a low moan that turned out to be the wind, or so I tried to convince myself. Birds perched nearby watched us without fluttering away as they normally would. A squirrel leapt off a branch and landed mere feet from Eleanor's boot, then scampered off. She flinched, and I laughed nervously, trying to ease the tension. Daniel snapped pictures, zooming in on distant shapes, a clump of moss, a half-submerged log, anything to pass the time. Marge joked about us getting paranoid, but her jokes were clipped. She didn't like this feeling either. We returned to the RV in the afternoon, tired and muddy. The generator started acting up. It sputtered, lights flickering inside. Our flashlights, fully charged the night before, now dimmed inexplicably. I replaced the batteries, but that only helped a little. Rain clouds gathered overhead. A short, intense downpour drenched our spare gear and the wood we'd intended to use for a campfire. Trapped inside the RV, we made sandwiches by lantern light. The atmosphere was heavy. "We should consider leaving," I said at one point, trying to sound casual. Eleanor frowned. "We just got here." She wanted to salvage the trip, to recapture whatever romance we'd hoped for. Marge scoffed. "Over some weird footprints and a flickering light. We'll be fine." Daniel said nothing, but he kept glancing at the window, as if expecting to see a face staring in. As dusk settled, the strangeness intensified. Laughter drifted through the trees again, childish, playful, and yet wrong. It echoed without direction, sometimes seeming to come from the river's edge, sometimes from behind the RV. We huddled inside, lights low. At some point, Daniel pulled out a Florida folklore book he'd packed, hoping to identify local birds and plants. Instead, he found an old story. He whispered it to us. Decades ago, children were said to have drowned in the Myakka River, lost souls who supposedly lingered, haunting unsuspecting travelers. Legend said they appeared as pale silhouettes, leaving small prints and whispers in the dark. "Great," Marge muttered. "Ghost stories. Just what we need." But as the night wore on, disbelief became harder to maintain. Around midnight, I heard a gentle tapping on the RV's exterior. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. For an instant, I saw them. 3 small silhouettes standing just beyond the lantern's glow. Their outlines were childlike, heads cocked at odd angles. The beam flickered, and they were gone. I yelped, stumbling back. Eleanor stifled a scream. Marge, skeptical but now afraid, grabbed the shotgun we kept for emergencies and stepped onto the small metal step outside the door. She aimed into the darkness, cursing and telling whoever was out there to show themselves. Silence. Nothing. We retreated inside. Daniel suggested we remain calm. Calm? Our hearts were pounding. I felt my palms grow sweaty, my throat dry. The darkness outside pressed in like a living thing. I tried to rationalize again, some local teenagers pulling a prank. But then, I recalled the tiny handprints, the laughter that seemed to move without source. Teenagers couldn't vanish on command. Eleanor clutched my arm. I could feel her trembling. Strangely, that fear sparked something protective in me. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, we leaned into each other without resentment. Whatever was happening, we had to face it together. Marge began pacing. "We need to leave," she said abruptly. Daniel pulled out a flashlight and tried to start the RV's engine. It sputtered and died. He checked under the hood with a small headlamp. Moments later, he rushed back, face ashen. "The engine cables are pulled out." It made no sense. He'd secured everything before nightfall. Something had tampered with our only means of escape. "That's it," Marge said. "I'm calling for help." But her phone showed no service. Our radios were silent static. We were stuck, at least until daylight. Eleanor sniffled. "What do they want?" She was on the verge of tears. I had no answer. Daniel flipped through the folklore book again. muttering half-remembered superstitions. "Maybe offerings," he said. He'd read somewhere that restless spirits, especially those of children, might be appeased by small gifts, candy, toys, comforting objects. Marge scoffed at the idea but said nothing else. In desperation, I dug through our storage compartments. I found an old plush doll that had belonged to my niece, left in the RV months ago. We had some candy bars, half melted in a Ziploc bag. I placed them in a cloth pouch and, with trembling hands, opened the RV door a crack. The air outside was moist and thick. I set the pouch on the step and closed the door again, locking it. We waited, breathless. There was no immediate reaction. Time crawled. The lantern flickered. Eleanor sat beside me, holding my hand tightly. We didn't talk about our relationship now. Whatever petty arguments we'd had seemed trivial. All that mattered was making it through this night. Marge tapped her foot, shotgun across her lap. Daniel stared at the windows, jaw clenched. Around 3 a.m, we heard sobbing. Soft, pitiful sobs that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I peered out cautiously. For a heartbeat, I glimpsed a small figure right at the edge of the clearing. A child-sized shape in ragged, old-fashioned clothing. Its face was pale, eyes hollow black pits. It reached out an arm, fingers too long and thin. The sobbing turned to laughter as I gasped and jerked back. When I looked again, it was gone. Eleanor began whispering prayers under her breath. She wasn't particularly religious, but fear pushes us to any comfort. Marge muttered curses. Daniel exhaled slowly and repeated, "We would leave at first light." Yes, first light. Just hang on until then. The haunting escalated. Something scraped along the RV's side, rattling the frame. Loose pots and pans clanged as if invisible hands toyed with them. The tapping resumed, now at the back window. I shouted, voice shaking, "Leave us alone!" A sudden stillness fell. Perhaps I angered them. Or maybe they were toying with us. Seconds stretched. Then came a shriek so piercing I felt it in my bones. Eleanor clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. Marge gripped the shotgun until her knuckles turned white. Daniel's eyes darted back and forth, searching for an explanation. But there was none. I must have lost track of time. Eventually, the wailing subsided. Quiet reigned, broken only by our ragged breathing. It might have been an hour before dawn's first glow touched the treetops. With trembling determination, Daniel announced he'd try to fix the engine now. We had to leave as soon as possible. None of us objected. I volunteered to stand guard. Marge positioned herself at the door, ready to cover Daniel's retreat. Eleanor wrapped herself in a blanket, shivering, and watched from the window. Daniel crept outside, and I shone a dim flashlight on his hands as he reconnected the cables. His breathing was loud in the silence. He worked fast. Suddenly he hissed, stumbling back. "Something touched me," he said, voice tight. He scrambled into the RV, pant leg torn, and a small scratch bleeding near his ankle. I saw no pursuer, just rustling ferns and empty shadows. He slammed the door. The engine coughed when he turned the key, and after a tense moment it caught. Relief flooded me. We had power, and soon we'd have an open road behind us. As the early sun peeked over the horizon, the presence seemed to recede. No more laughter, no more tapping, just stillness. With the RV finally running, we abandoned any thought of a leisurely morning. We piled in, slamming the door. Marge tossed the shotgun onto a seat, her face pale and drawn. Eleanor kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting to see a face pressed against the window. We left quickly, tearing down the dirt road, the RV bumping and groaning. I didn't look back until we hit a patch of open ground. When I finally glanced in the side mirror, I caught a fleeting shape at the edge of the tree line, a small pale arm raised as if in farewell. My heart lurched, and I faced forward again, determined not to slow down. No one spoke during the long drive back to civilization. We passed a ranger station. I considered stopping, reporting what we'd seen. But what would I say? That ghost children tormented us in the night, that they left tiny handprints and whispered our names. We kept going, silent, each wrapped in our own disbelieving terror. Back home, we tried to rationalize. Maybe someone played an elaborate prank. Maybe it was group hysteria triggered by isolation and faulty equipment. But at night, when I closed my eyes, I heard that laughter. I saw those empty eyes, and the scratch on Daniel's ankle turned into a small scar he still carries. Eleanor and I never truly explained the incident to anyone, but oddly, surviving that terror brought us closer. The next time we had a petty argument, we remembered the night in Miyaka, the night we clung to each other, facing horrors beyond logic. We learned that if nothing else, we could be each other's refuge in the dark. Marge refused to talk about the trip. She sold her share of camping gear and now prefers hotel vacations. Daniel became fascinated with local legends, reading up on every old story he could find. Sometimes he brings me a scrap of folklore, something about spirits who linger where tragedy struck, feeding on fear, luring in the living with their calls. He never finds a satisfying explanation, only more tales that echo our own experience. I can't say what those entities really were. Ghosts of drowned children, some ancient Florida swamp spirits taking the form of innocence corrupted. I know this. They were not kind, not friendly. They toyed with us, terrorized us, and if we had stayed longer, who's to say no one would have died? Perhaps their patience had limits. Perhaps our offering of candy and a doll amused them. But would that amusement have run out? I often think about that final glimpse, the small figure raising an arm. Was it mocking? Waving goodbye to their would-be playthings? Or was there a flicker of sorrow, a final echo of the children they might have once been? I'll never know. What I do know is that I'll never return to Miyaka River State Park. There are places where the veil between the living and the dead is too thin, where old tragedies leave stains that cannot be scrubbed out by time. We wandered too close and paid for our curiosity with a night we can't unlive, can't explain, and can't forget. Now, when I close my eyes, I sometimes hear distant giggles in the silence of my suburban home. I bolt upright, heart hammering, telling myself it's just memory, just trauma playing tricks. Yet I reach for Eleanor's hand, and she squeezes mine, understanding, remembering, holding on. We survived that night together, and that fact alone stands between us and complete terror. We are safe now, or so we tell ourselves. The ghosts remain deep in the Florida backwoods, where moss sways and the river flows silently around old secrets. I pray they stay there, confined to the shadows. And I pray no one else stumbles into their playground as foolishly as we did. My name is Sarah Daniels. I'm 28 years old, and this happened late last summer in Big Cypress National Preserve, Florida. I remember the day I arrived like it was yesterday. I'd come to Big Cypress with my RV not just to photograph wildlife, but to prove something to myself. That I could live off-grid, rely on no one else, and thrive. I'd quit my corporate job in Miami a month earlier, drained by the city's clamor and demands. As a budding nature photographer, I believed that capturing the elusive beauty of Florida's swamp ecosystem might launch my independent career and confirm that I was strong enough to carve my own path. The preserve's entrance felt like a threshold to another world, a narrow road flanked by cypress and sawgrass prairies as far as the eye could see. Mosquitoes buzzed in a humid green haze. A short distance off a remote dirt road, I found a primitive campsite. The ranger who had checked me in, Ranger Harper, she looked to be in her 40s, with a weathered face and tired eyes, had warned me to stay along marked areas, watch out for flooding, and never wander off at dusk. She seemed almost maternal as she said, "This place can be tricky after dark. Stick to your plan and be careful, Ms. Daniels." I thanked her, thinking she was just being cautious. I parked my RV beside a stand of spindly cypress, the ground beneath squelchy from recent rains. The air smelled like damp earth and decay, natural smells of a thriving swamp. With a sigh, I started unloading my gear. Camera equipment, spare batteries, a solar charger, and enough food to last a week. The goal was simple: photograph rare birds and nocturnal mammals at dawn and dusk, then spend afternoons editing, journaling, and enjoying the quiet. No company needed. But that first day, as I scouted the area, something felt off. Not wrong exactly, but too quiet. I listened for the usual chatter of wildlife, bird calls, the scurry of small mammals, but heard mostly a muffled hush, punctuated by sudden eerie silences. The humidity pressed against my skin. I brushed it off as nerves. My RV was supposed to be my fortress of solitude. That evening, as I prepared a simple meal, the lights flickered. The generator coughed. I frowned. I had maintained everything before leaving civilization. The solar charger I planned to rely on for my camera gear refused to work properly, no matter how I angled it toward the setting sun. Later, as dusk washed the swamp in purplish shadows, I ventured a few yards from my campsite to snap a photo of a heron perched on a log. When I returned, a man was there, leaning casually against my RV's side, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Hey there," he said, smiling. He had sandy brown hair, a trim beard, and wore khaki shorts and a moisture-wicking shirt like a regular hiker. He introduced himself as Ethan, saying he was also camping nearby to study Florida's ecosystems. I hadn't heard another vehicle approach, and my campsite was well off the main track. How had he found me? I tried to be friendly. "I'm Sarah," I said. Didn't expect company this far out. His gaze was bright and curious. "Big Cypress is special. I like to find the quiet spots. Heard your generator, figured I'd say hi." He nodded toward my camera. "Looking for rare wildlife? You must be hoping to catch those barred owls at sunrise." He spoke as if he knew my plans, though I'd told no one exactly what I was after. Maybe he guessed. Maybe he was just well informed. I felt uneasy but dismissed it as my own paranoia. We chatted a few minutes, and he promised he wouldn't bother me if I preferred solitude. Then he slipped away, heading toward the tree line, moving almost soundlessly. As night fell, I locked the RV door and checked the windows. I felt silly doing it, but I couldn't shake the strange vibe Ethan gave off. The swamp outside glistened in moonlight. Wind rustled the cypress branches. At some point, I thought I heard something like a distant laugh, but it could have been the wind catching a hollow trunk. The next morning, I discovered the RV battery draining faster than it should. Without a functioning solar charger, my camera batteries were precious. I rose early to check my trail camera, which I'd placed 100 yards out. Trudging through muck and mosquitoes, I found nothing unusual, except footprints in the soft mud. They looked human, but large, and ended abruptly behind a thick stand of palmettos. No sign of Ethan, no sign of anyone else. I forced a laugh at myself. Big deal footprints. Probably mine, distorted by rain. Yet the shape was different, toes too long, the heel oddly narrow. That afternoon, the wildlife I tried to photograph seemed skittish. I'd approach a cluster of wading birds, and they'd scatter too soon. A deer bolted past my campsite at midday, panic in its eyes, as if running from something unseen. The humidity pressed closer. My boots and camera bag got soaked during a sudden downpour, forcing me back inside to dry out my equipment. On top of that, my mosquito repellent seemed useless. Every moment outside was a battle against a cloud of biting insects. When I tried using the radio to check in with Ranger Harper for a weather update, I got only static. My cell phone had zero reception. This was expected, but somehow it rattled me more now that unease had taken root. Around sunset, I started feeling watched. I sat by the RV's small window, camera ready to capture wildlife in the golden hour. Instead, I spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the clearing. Ethan again. He stood there, half in shadow, smiling that same friendly smile. I lifted my hand to wave, but he was gone. One heartbeat he was there. The next, empty space. I blinked, disoriented. Maybe I imagined him. I tried to calm down. Perhaps I was just jumpy, stressed from technical failures. But as darkness deepened, I heard scraping along the RV's exterior. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the door cautiously, and shone it around. Nothing. My heart hammered. Hours later, I woke to a thump on the roof. I froze, listening. Had a branch fallen? Something skittered overhead. I dared not go out. In the gloom, I thought I heard my name whispered. Sarah. It sounded like Ethan's voice, but stretched and distorted. At dawn, I found a terrible sight near the RV tires. A dead possum, torn open as if by claws. Fresh blood soaked the dirt. Horrified, I buried it a short distance away, shivering despite the heat. Had a predator left it there? Why so close to my RV? I decided to look for Ranger Harper to report the disturbance. It was a few miles to the station, but I had a bike strapped to my RV. I rode off, feeling marginally safer in motion. The trail was overgrown, and an eerie silence followed me, as if the swamp watched my every pedal. About halfway, the radio on my belt crackled. "Ara." Static. I slowed, tried to respond. No reply but a rising squeal of static, and what sounded like a muffled sob. Shaken, I turned back, deciding not to leave my campsite unguarded. If someone tampered with my RV again, I'd be stranded. Back at camp, Ethan appeared again, and this time, I forced myself to confront him. He emerged from behind a cypress trunk with an odd grace. "You look troubled," he said gently. "Need help?" I studied him. He wore the same outfit as before, not a speck of mud on him, despite this swampy terrain. "Do you know anything about what's been happening? Strange noises? Something on my roof last night?" He smiled, eyes reflecting a weird gleam. "Must have been wildlife. This preserve is full of surprises." I pressed on. "Where exactly is your campsite?" He shrugged. "Nearby. Hard to explain. I move around." "Have you met Ranger Harper?" I asked. His expression flickered. "Seen her around. She's busy." I didn't trust him. Something was very wrong. I retreated to my RV and locked the door again. Through a side window, I watched Ethan step behind a cluster of bushes and vanish soundlessly. I waited, counted to 20, then swung the door open. No sign of him, not even footprints in the mud. That evening, determined to confirm I wasn't losing my mind, I set a camera trap facing the RV. If Ethan came by, I'd have proof. As darkness fell, I heard a low growl outside, like a big cat snarl, then a burst of what sounded like laughter. Animal or human? I couldn't tell. I clutched my flashlight and a kitchen knife. The RV walls felt thin. Around midnight, banging rattled the back wall. I shouted, "Go away!" The noise stopped. Silence pressed in. Then I heard my mother's voice, clear as day. "Sarah, help me." My mother was hundreds of miles away, safe at home. This was impossible. Fear prickled at my scalp. The voice changed, warping into Ethan's soft drawl. "Sarah, come outside. It's so beautiful tonight." My heart pounded. This was no human trick. No poacher or prankster could mimic voices and vanish without footprints. Something in these swamps could take on forms, voices. I remembered vague folklore I'd read online. Native American legends of shapeshifters, beings that wore human skin to deceive and trap the unwary. A skinwalker, some called it. But this was Florida, not the Southwest. Yet every region has its legends, maybe different names for similar horrors. The world is full of mysteries we dismiss until they stand outside our door. I huddled inside, praying for dawn. My radio crackled again, and I heard Ranger Harper's voice scream, cut off abruptly. Fear settled like lead in my stomach. Had this creature attacked her? Killed her? Without help, I was alone here. When morning came, I stepped outside, shaking, to check my camera trap. The files were corrupted, glitchy images of distorted shapes. Nothing recognizable, just a blur and static. My RV's engine wouldn't start. I opened the hood and found wires yanked out. I had basic tool knowledge, but not enough for a quick fix. Still, I tried. The thought of staying another night here was unbearable. While I fumbled with tools, I heard twigs snap. I looked up to see a figure lurking a few yards away. It looked like Ethan, but not. His face was paler, eyes sunken, limbs slightly elongated as if the shape didn't fit perfectly. I froze. He grinned, a predatory grin. I ducked into the RV, slammed the door, and locked it. I could hear scraping along the metal, as if claws dragged over the surface. Trying to steady my shaking hands, I reconnected the engine cables, whispering to myself. I'd read that some people tried appeasing spirits with offerings. I had nothing but fear and desperation. I had to rely on my wits. Eventually, the scraping stopped. I peeked outside. No one there. I tried the ignition, and the engine sputtered again. Almost caught. I fiddled some more, hands greasy and trembling. As I worked, I heard footsteps circling. A glance through the windshield showed me Ethan's form again. He stood motionless, head tilted at an unnatural angle, like a curious predator. When I caught sight of him, he darted behind a tree with inhuman speed. My breath hitched. This thing was playing with me, trying to break my resolve. I wouldn't let it. I had to escape. I tested the engine again, and it roared to life, mercifully. I wasted no time. Grabbing my essentials, I jumped into the driver's seat. With a crunch of gears, I pulled onto the muddy path leading away. My RV bounced over roots and potholes. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse. A figure bounding after me, shifting shape as it ran. One moment it looked like Ethan, the next like a gaunt creature covered in patchy, dark fur. I pushed the accelerator harder, heart hammering. My tires skidded, splattering mud, barely gripping the wet ground. The entity gained on me, its eyes glowing with malicious hunger. I risked a final glance. It lunged to the side, disappearing into the undergrowth. Was it giving up or trying to flank me? A broken branch ahead nearly stalled my escape, but I veered around it, the RV scraping against a trunk. Come on, I repeated like a mantra. At last, through the cypress silhouettes, I glimpsed a wider trail. The main road, almost free. The RV burst onto the gravel, and I accelerated until I saw a sign pointing towards the main ranger station. I slowed only when I felt safe enough, a mile or so out of the deepest swampland. I never saw the creature again, but my mind conjured it in every shadow. I made it to a safer campground near a small town. Shaken, filthy, and emotionally wrecked, I tried to report what happened. The authorities looked at me with pity, suggested I might have encountered a poacher or a deranged vagrant. Ranger Harper was listed as on duty that week, but I never saw her again. Rumors whispered that a ranger had gone missing. No confirmation came. No body was found. Back in a motel room, I checked my camera and found no solid proof, just corrupted files. I sat on the bed staring at the blank TV screen. What did I encounter? A shapeshifter? A skinwalker? A swamp entity beyond our understanding? I learned something about myself in that terror. Independence, I realized, isn't measured by how isolated I can be, but by knowing when to ask for help and when to trust my instincts. I'd romanticized solitude. Nature is beautiful, but not always gentle. I used to think danger in the wild came only from gators or venomous snakes, things you could prepare for. But there are old, hungry forces out there that do not respect reason or strength of will. They feed on fear and isolation. In the end, I emerged alive. That's more than I can say for Ranger Harper, who I suspect never left that swamp, nor for anyone else the creature might have claimed. I returned home, contacting family and friends, people I'd pulled away from in my quest for independence. I never told them the full story, just bits and pieces. I knew they wouldn't believe me if I did. I barely believe it myself. Today, when I look at the photos I managed to save, beautiful shots of herons, deer, and silent cypress groves, I feel a pang of dread. The swamp's beauty hides old mysteries and terrors that no camera lens can capture. The experience changed me. I've ventured into the wilderness since then, but never without careful planning, never without a buddy, and never so deep that I can't feel the presence of another human. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, I think I hear that voice again, my own name drifting on stagnant air. I wake with a start, heart pounding, telling myself it's just a memory. But memory or not, I know it's a warning. Some places in this world belong to older things. They wear our faces, imitate our words, and relish our fear. And I was foolish enough to wander into their hunting ground, alone. I won't make that mistake again. My name is Avery Chen, and I am 37 years old. This happened last spring in Jonathan Dickinson State Park, Florida. I still remember the exact afternoon I pulled into that quiet campsite, my RV's tires crunching over sandy gravel, a pale blue sky above, and warm coastal air drifting in from the Atlantic just a few miles away. I had come here with a purpose, to document and debunk an old legend that clung to these woods like Spanish moss. As a traveling historian and heritage blogger, I specialized in separating fact from fiction. I'd toured Civil War battlefields, explored ghost towns in the Southwest, and rummaged through archives that smelled of old ink and dust. In most cases, I found rational explanations for so-called hauntings and curses. I was sure this trip would be no different. The rumors I'd uncovered online spoke of old witches, women who supposedly fled persecution in the Carolinas centuries ago, hiding deep in the Florida wilderness. Stories claimed they left their mark on this landscape, that their spirits still lingered among the tall pines of Jonathan Dickinson. Ridiculous, I told myself. Just another local legend twisted by time. I planned to stay a week, gather facts, and produce a well-researched article that would bring new readers to my blog and perhaps soothe my lingering heartbreak after a recent breakup. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the campsite. The park was off-season quiet. Birds chattered lazily in the pine flatwoods, and I could hear the distant hum of a kayak tour far down the Loxahatchee River. My assigned site was a modest clearing edged by slender pines and palmettos. I stepped out of the RV, stretching my legs, and looked around. The solitude, at first, felt peaceful. Ranger Elena Vasquez had checked me in at the visitor center earlier. Short, tanned, and with a perpetual squint from working in the sun, she'd offered a terse welcome, handed me a detailed map, and advised I stick to marked trails. When I'd asked about local legends, she shrugged and told me to be careful. She didn't elaborate, just a vague warning not to wander off established paths. At the time, I thought she was simply protective of the park's fragile ecosystem or weary of thrill seekers. Now I wonder if she was holding something back. I spent the rest of that first evening organizing my mobile workstation. My RV was both a shelter and an office on wheels, equipped with a fold-out desk, a laptop, camera gear, and a small library of folklore references. Once settled, I cooked a simple meal on the propane stove. Outside, the pine needles whispered in the breeze. The sky turned coral and gold as the sun dipped low. I took a short walk near the trailhead to orient myself. I had come prepared for wildlife, raccoons, maybe bobcats, possibly even an occasional black bear, but I saw nothing unusual. That night I slept well. No disturbances, no strange shadows at the windows. I woke optimistic, ready to begin research. The next morning, I tried to power my laptop using the RV's solar panels. The Florida sun was bright and hot, but somehow my panels underperformed. I fiddled with the connections, checked the wiring. Everything looked fine, yet the battery refused to charge properly. Annoyed, I decided to explore first and worry about electronics later. Following the map, I headed down a well-trodden trail that led toward the Loxahatchee River. I planned to find any mention of the witches in old newspapers or archives later in the week, but for now I just wanted to get a feel for the terrain. Halfway down the trail, I met a young man carrying a kayak paddle over his shoulder. Marcus Everett. Late 20s, athletic, cheerful. We struck up a casual conversation. I told him I was researching folklore for a blog post. He grinned. "Oh, you must have heard the witch stories, right?" I nodded. "Yes, that's part of it. I heard something about a coven that supposedly settled here long ago." Marcus's smile faltered. He glanced at the tree line. "Yeah, people talk. Stories passed around campfires. Women in old-fashioned cloaks, strange lights in the pines, weird carvings on trees. But that's just nonsense." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow. "Honestly, you should just enjoy the scenery. No need to dig too deep." I pressed him for more, but he became evasive, muttering that he had to return his kayak. He left in a hurry. Strange. If it was all nonsense, why the sudden discomfort? Back at my campsite, I took notes on our conversation. Maybe Marcus was simply spooked by my inquiries. Local communities sometimes hold tight to their legends, reluctant to see them dissected by outsiders. I reviewed my research. The witches supposedly fled persecution in the early 1700s, drifting south. One diary fragment, found in a Carolina archive, mentioned a handful of women gone to the Floridas to escape witch trials. Another local whisper suggested they performed rituals under certain pine trees. I shrugged off the tension and spent the afternoon photographing the area. But as I ventured slightly off trail, I found something unsettling. Strange carvings in the bark of a towering pine. They weren't initials or hearts like bored campers might leave. Instead, they formed a spiraling symbol, intricate and deep. I touched the grooves. The cuts looked old, the bark grown over in places. Something about them felt wrong, as if they were made for a purpose I couldn't grasp. That evening, my laptop battery drained again, and my camera's memory card corrupted after I tried to review the photos of that carved tree. Furious, I popped the card into a backup reader. Same issue. Files unreadable. I blamed humidity, cheap electronics, anything but the paranormal. Still, unease gnawed at me. I tried to reach Ranger Elena on the park's short-range radio they'd lent me. Just static. My cell phone was useless here. I decided to write notes by hand, old school, while the sun dipped and the frogs started their chorus. I would try to talk to the ranger in person tomorrow. That night, as I was reading in the dim light of my lantern, I heard something outside. A soft scraping against my RV wall, like a branch dragged slowly across the metal. I froze, listening. The wind was gentle, not strong enough to cause such a noise. Heart pounding, I clicked off the lantern and peered through a window. Darkness, no movement, just a faint silhouette of pines. After a few minutes, the scraping stopped. I chalked it up to a random animal passing by. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been testing the boundaries, letting me know I wasn't alone. The next morning, determined to get a clearer picture, I set out earlier. The trails were quiet. A few cardinals flitted among branches. The smell of pine resin and damp earth filled my lungs. I was determined to find concrete historical evidence. About a mile from camp, where a small spur trail vanished into thick underbrush, I spotted more carvings on another tree, a variation of the spiral symbol I'd seen before. As I examined it, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. Turning, I saw someone standing deeper in the woods. A cloaked figure, impossible in this heat, partially hidden behind dense foliage. My heart stuttered. "Hello," I called, but the figure vanished. I stumbled through the brush, searching, but found no footprints, no broken branches. Nothing but silence. Stumbling back to the main trail, I questioned my own senses. Maybe a trick of the light, a hallucination sparked by fear. Still, I had seen something, or thought I did. I returned to camp shaken. The park felt different now, oppressive, as if the pines leaned closer, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to know. The day turned cloudy. I tried the radio again. Nothing. I considered driving to the visitor center. When I turned the RV ignition, the engine struggled to start, as if drained. Eventually, it caught. I wouldn't risk stalling far from camp. Maybe I'd try later. As afternoon faded, I heard the distant caw of a crow. It landed on my side mirror and stared, unblinking. Crows are common enough, but the way it fixed me in its black gaze made my scalp prickle. I shooed it, and it flapped away with an irritated croak. I forced myself to focus. I had come here to write an article. I needed sources, facts, and first-hand accounts. Digging through my reference materials, I found a mention of a hidden journal in a local archive. I'd planned to visit the Jupiter Community Library a few days later. Now I wished I had gone before coming here. All I had were scraps of rumor, witches fleeing witch trials, carving symbols, whispering old magic into the Florida night. That evening, I cooked a rush dinner, constantly glancing at the windows. Darkness came too soon. The insects hummed loudly, as if trying to drown out subtle sounds. Then I heard it. Faint chanting, so soft I thought it must be the wind. Low, droning voices at the edge of hearing. I pressed my ear to the wall. The sound ebbed and flowed, coming from all around. I tried to record it with my phone, but the file wouldn't save. Technology failing me again. My throat tightened. I repeated logic in my head. Sound can carry strangely through forests. Maybe there's a distant group of campers. But no other campers were registered as far as I knew. The park was quiet this time of year. I tried to sleep. The chanting ceased, replaced by an unsettling silence. Around midnight, I jolted awake to a thump. I reached for a flashlight, shining it through the window. Just darkness. Then I noticed something. A small bundle hanging from my awning, a twisted arrangement of sticks and dried herbs, tied with a strip of old cloth. My stomach dropped. Someone had placed it there. I rushed outside, heart hammering, ripped it down, and tossed it into the fire pit. The bundle smelled foul, like rotten leaves. I lit a match, burning it to ash. A sudden gust of wind swirled the smoke into my face, making my eyes water. Back inside, I locked the door, as if that could stop whatever lurked out there. I regretted not leaving earlier, but now, it was the dead of night. The engine might fail again. I told myself I'd leave at dawn. I barely slept. When the sky lightened, I stepped out to survey the area. Fresh scratch marks marred the RV door, thin and erratic, as if made by crooked fingernails. My blood ran cold. I glanced at the ground. Muddy footprints, small and bare, led away from the RV and vanished into the brush. Human footprints? They ended abruptly, as if whoever made them simply disappeared. I hurried inside, panic rising. This was no prank. The talisman, the chanting, the carvings, something ancient and hostile was here. The witches' spirits? The rational part of me rebelled. Ghosts or spirits couldn't leave footprints or hang bundles. Could a living person be imitating the legends? A local cult, maybe, reenacting old rituals to scare off intruders. Whatever it was, I was done. I needed to get out. I turned the ignition. The RV coughed but wouldn't catch. I tried again and again until the battery began to fade. My heart sank. I popped the hood to check the engine and found wires yanked out, dangling loose. Sabotage. My hands shook as I attempted a makeshift repair. I'm not a mechanic, but I know a bit about cars. It took hours, the sun climbing high, sweat dripping into my eyes. Meanwhile, I heard distant crows calling, and once I thought I heard soft laughter drifting through the pines. By early afternoon, I managed a temporary fix. The engine sputtered to life. Relief flooded me. I quickly gathered my valuables. I didn't care about leaving the site tidy. I just wanted distance. With trembling hands, I put the RV in gear. As I rolled out, the pines seemed to close in, their branches arching overhead. The dirt road was narrow. My heart thrummed in my ears. Near a bend, I glimpsed something in the rearview mirror. 3 cloaked figures standing in a clearing. They were tall, thin, and motionless. One raised a hand toward me, fingers splayed. I couldn't make out faces under their hoods. I pressed the accelerator, the RV lurching forward, wheels spitting sand. Within minutes, the figures were gone, swallowed by the landscape. I kept driving, fighting tears. I wasn't safe yet. If the engine died again out here, I was finished. The road widened. Eventually, I found the main route out of the park. Passing the visitor center, I debated whether to stop and report what I'd seen. But what would I say? That I'd been harassed by cloaked apparitions who sabotaged my engine and whispered in the night. I saw no sign of Ranger Elena. The building looked closed. I pressed on, merging onto the highway that led to civilization. Only after I reached a crowded gas station on US 1 did I exhale in relief. Among tourists, cars, and lights, I felt safer. I parked, stepped out, and let the sunshine soak in. I examined my camera again, still corrupted files. My notes were smeared, sweaty from my trembling grip. I had no proof. Just a few odd carvings I remembered and the memory of spiraling symbols. I asked myself if I dreamed it all, but the scratch marks on my RV door were still there. I ended up renting a motel room in Jupiter that evening. The walls felt thin, but at least I wasn't alone in the wilderness. I tried to find any record of these witches online, searching local history forums. Vague references popped up. Settlers who vanished in the early 1700s. Rumors of women performing rituals under certain pine groves. No concrete evidence. Nothing I could use to prove what I encountered. I never found Ranger Elena or Marcus again. When I returned to the park a week later, cautiously in broad daylight and only to the visitor center, another ranger told me Elena was off duty for a personal leave. He didn't know when she'd be back. About Marcus, no idea who he was. Just a visitor, maybe. I didn't push. I didn't want to linger. The memory of those hooded figures and the chanting voices still haunted my nights. I had gone there to debunk legends, to find rational truth. Instead, I'd encountered something that defied logic. Spirits of witches, a coven still haunting the land after centuries, or a group of very human fanatics carrying on old rites. In the end, I left the puzzle unsolved. Some stories are better left buried among the roots and needles of old pines. I never published the details, just a watered-down post about the park's beauty, advising readers to respect closed trails and local warnings. I wanted to protect future travelers from stumbling into what I had found. Months later, I'm still rattled. I often wake before dawn, certain I hear whispering outside my bedroom window, though I live in a quiet neighborhood now. I keep expecting to see spiraling carvings on my fence, or find a twisted talisman hanging from my porch. It never happens. But the fear lives on inside me, a reminder that not every legend wants to be uncovered. Sometimes the past is not dead and buried. Sometimes it lingers, watchful and cruel, waiting for a curious soul to wander into its domain. That's what happened to me, Avery Chen, 37, historian and blogger. Last spring, Jonathan Dickinson State Park taught me that truth and folklore can blur in dangerous ways. I escaped, but part of me never left those pine-shrouded trails, and I will never forget the sound of that soft, eerie chanting drifting through the Florida night. Mine is Jonas Parker. I'm 52 years old. and this happened earlier this spring in Tate's Hell State Forest, Florida. I remember the exact day I rolled my RV down that sandy access road. The sunlight was sharp, the sky an unclouded vault of blue, and my dashboard clock read just after noon. I'd planned this trip for weeks, another solo expedition into Florida's wilder pockets, camera gear in tow, determined to film rare birds and nocturnal mammals. I'd even made a checklist. Lately, my life had been a series of well-laid plans and careful notes. Anything to give structure after all the chaos in my personal life. I was a firefighter once, for nearly 30 years, before I hung up the helmet and decided to spend my retirement documenting wildlife. I guess I wanted to trade sirens and smoke for birdsong and swaying trees. People called it a cliché, the tough old-timer seeking peace in nature. But for me, it was more than that. I needed time alone, and I needed to feel useful again, even if it was just capturing a rare woodpecker on film. If I could prove to myself I could thrive out here, maybe I'd feel worthy enough to pick up the phone and call my daughter. We hadn't spoken in months, and guilt gnawed at me daily. My destination was Tate's Hell State Forest, a name that should have warned me. I'd read the legends, a place named after a pioneer who got lost, poisoned, and stumbled out half dead. Locals whispered about odd occurrences, strange lights, sulfur smells. They joked about Old Scratch lurking behind the pines. I took it all as a bit of folklore, just stories people tell for a laugh. I'd handled my share of real horrors, fires that could melt steel, accidents that tore families apart. What could a forest possibly throw at me? Before entering the main dirt road into the forest, I stopped at a roadside bait shop. I needed ice and a bit of local intel. The place smelled of old fish and wood rot. Behind the counter stood Billy Reeves, a grizzled fisherman who must have been at least 60. He eyed my RV and camera tripod with mild amusement. "Headed into Tate's Hell, are you?" he said, thumbing tobacco into his cheek. "That's right," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm filming wildlife." Billy's gaze grew distant. "Stay on the main roads. Don't go wandering too deep. Folks get turned around in there." He paused, then added in a hush, "Some say the devil himself likes to toy with travelers, whisper their sins in the dark, make 'em lose their way." I gave a polite smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Inside, I rolled my eyes. Ghost stories. But something in Billy's tone was too serious for comfort. A few hours later, I found a decent clearing off a sand road where I could set up camp. I parked the RV under a stand of pines. Outside, the forest sang with insects. The air was humid but pleasant. I carried out my camera gear, tested my tripod, and felt confident. I had a week's worth of supplies, extra batteries, backup chargers, everything I needed. Maybe this documentary footage would help me build a small YouTube following, or at least give me a purpose. On my second day, as I was adjusting my camera traps along a trail, I spotted a ranger on an ATV. He pulled to a stop nearby. I remember him introducing himself as Wyatt Green, middle-aged, sunburned, and looking a bit exhausted. "Morning," he said. "You staying out here long?" "About a week," I replied. "Just filming, nothing invasive." He nodded. "We've had some odd disturbances lately. Campsites abandoned, strange scorch marks and damp ground. Doesn't make sense. If you see anything off, let me know." He handed me a business card with a radio frequency scrawled on it. "Keep a good fire at night and maintain a clear perimeter. It helps." He seemed hesitant, as if he wanted to say more but thought better of it. I thanked him, feeling vaguely uneasy. First Billy with his devil story, now the ranger hinting at odd disturbances. But I was a grown man, not prone to spooking easily. That night, I settled in. My RV's small fridge hummed. I had a lantern lit and some notes spread on my fold-out desk. Everything felt normal until I noticed my lights flickering. The overhead lamp dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again. The battery monitor, which should have been steady, fluctuated strangely. I checked wiring, no obvious issue. Solar panels were brand new, yet power drained oddly fast. I didn't want to panic, so I chalked it up to a loose connection. I'd fix it in the morning. I stepped outside for fresh air. The forest was moonlit, shadows stretching between the trees. I caught a faint whiff of something unpleasant, like rotten eggs or sulfur. I scanned my surroundings but found nothing. Maybe a swampy patch nearby. I'd smelled worse as a firefighter. The next day, I tried to hike a bit deeper, carefully placing camera traps near a bog where I'd heard rare wading birds might feed. The trail seemed straightforward, but when I tried to return, I found myself going in circles. The markers on trees I'd noted earlier were gone, or I was mixing them up. I spent a tense hour finding my way back. It rattled me. I prided myself on my sense of direction. Could I have gotten careless? When I returned to camp, I found my RV fridge had warmed slightly, and my backup battery pack was dead. Strange. I stepped outside to double-check the panels and nearly gagged. That sulfur smell again, stronger. I followed it around the RV, expecting to find a dead animal. Instead, I discovered a small patch of charred earth behind a palmetto bush. The soil was blackened and cracked, as if by fire. But everything else was damp. The forest had rained a bit last night. How could a fire burn so hot and leave no other signs? I remembered Ranger Green's mention of scorch marks and Billy's warnings. My chest tightened. I pressed on, focusing on my work. That evening, I managed to record some distant animal calls. I pretended that was all I cared about, ignoring the crawling unease in my gut. As dusk fell, the noises began. Low growls, deep in the forest. At first I thought maybe a panther, but it sounded too guttural. Then laughter, faint, echoing laughter that didn't sound quite human. It set my teeth on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and walked a small circle around the campsite. The laughter faded into whispers I couldn't understand. Just wind in the branches, I told myself, retreating to the RV. Inside, the lights flickered again. I took out the radio frequency Ranger Green gave me and tried to call him, but all I got was static and something like a faint hiss. No reply. My cell had no service here. I considered leaving early, but my pride resisted. I was no quitter. On the third morning, I woke up determined to prove myself. I made coffee on the propane stove, checked my gear. While sipping, I caught movement at the edge of the clearing. I hurried out, camera in hand, hoping to spot a fox or deer. Instead, I found odd footprints near the RV. They looked like cloven hoof prints, burned into the soil. I knelt, touched the ground. Warm ash stained my fingertips. I remembered Billy's stories about the devil. A chill ran down my spine. This had to be someone messing with me. Maybe teenagers playing a prank, or poachers trying to scare me off. I wasn't sure, but the strangeness was mounting. That afternoon I ventured out again, determined to find some rational explanation. Halfway along a muddy trail, I smelled sulfur again and saw red lights flickering between cypress trunks. They hovered, shifting slowly. I squinted. Could it be distant taillights from a road? But we were deep in the forest. The lights moved closer, then disappeared. My heart thumped. I turned back, unsettled. Back at camp, I discovered a camera trap I'd set up had been smashed. The metal casing twisted. The memory card melted into a black lump. Heat welled behind my eyes. This was too deliberate. Something didn't want me filming. Fear tangled in my gut. I tried the radio again, calling Green's name. Static. A faint voice broke through. "Run!" Then nothing. At sunset, desperation set in. I decided I would leave at first light. I had enough of legends and eerie signs. Pride be damned. But that night was the worst yet. It started with a tapping on the RV door, soft at first, then insistent. I switched off my lantern, held my breath. The tapping turned to scraping. I shouted, "Who's there?" No answer, just a low chuckle outside, like someone mocking me. Heart pounding, I flung the door open, flashlight raised. The clearing was empty. Only my own heavy breathing broke the silence. I spun in a circle, light beams slicing through trunks. For a second, I swore I saw a figure leaning against a pine. A tall, thin shadow, shoulders hunched, with reflective eyes. When I aimed the flashlight, it darted behind the tree, impossibly fast. I ran forward, trembling but furious. Nothing, just a faint sulfur smell and the distant rustle of leaves. I retreated inside. Minutes later, something rattled the back window of the RV. I heard a low voice that seemed to whisper my name. Jonas. It stretched the sibilant, mocking me. I clenched my fists, anger warring with terror. How could anyone know my name? I'd told no one but Ranger Green and Billy. I realized then that whatever this presence was, it knew me. It knew my fear, and it seemed to feed on it. I tried to sleep, but my dreams twisted into nightmares. I saw my daughter's face, angry and hurt. I saw the house I once lived in consumed by invisible flames. I woke in sweat, and outside, the wind had died. Complete silence, an unnatural hush that made my ears ring. Morning didn't come fast enough. At the first glow of dawn, I packed up. The RV engine sputtered. I checked under the hood. Somehow the wires I'd carefully inspected were yanked loose again. My hands shook as I reconnected them. It felt like a test, as if the forest wanted to see if I'd flee or give in. Eventually, the engine started. I took no chances, steering the RV back down the sand road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the path. Standing at the edge of the clearing were three silhouettes. They looked human-shaped but elongated, their arms too long, heads tilted. One raised a hand, as if waving goodbye. My vision blurred with panic. When I looked again, they were gone. I pressed the gas pedal, desperate to find the main road. But the turns seemed wrong, the landscape unfamiliar. Signs I remembered seeing before were tilted, or maybe I had come from another direction. I circled a bend and hit a puddle. The RV skidded, splashing muddy water. For a moment I thought I'd be stuck, but I forced it through, gritting my teeth. Sulfur drifted again, and I heard that laughter riding the wind. My throat went dry. I slammed the dashboard with my fist. "Leave me alone!" I yelled, as if shouting at the forest itself. Something about that act, that outburst of raw fear and regret, changed the atmosphere. I recalled Ranger Green's advice. Keep a fire lit at night, maintain a perimeter. I hadn't done that last night. Maybe fire would have kept the entity at bay. Too late now, I was fleeing. And then I thought of my daughter. I felt this crushing guilt, the estrangement I never resolved. The present seemed to feed on these regrets, on my hidden shame. Maybe it sensed my sins. Nothing grand, just a father's failures. The memory of harsh words exchanged over Christmas, the silence afterwards. I was no saint. My heart hammered. I needed to stand firm. I stopped the RV in a wide spot of the road. It was risky, but I had to try something. Stepping outside, I mustered my courage. "I know you're out there," I said, voice echoing among pines. "I'm not afraid of you." That was a lie, but I tried to sound strong. I've faced real flames, real tragedies. Whatever you are, devil, spirit, I won't be toyed with. Silence, then a gentle rustling. No laughter, no whisper. Just the drip of water from leaves after a recent drizzle. Maybe it was my imagination, but I sensed a shift, less oppression in the air. I climbed back in and drove on. After 2 more bends, I recognized a marker post. I'd found the main route out. Relief surged. Within half an hour, I emerged from Tate's Hell, the paved road shining like salvation. I made it to a small town diner on the highway just as my stomach growled. Inside the diner, bright lights and human voices felt like a different world. I ordered coffee and eggs, hands still shaking. Checking my camera gear, I found corrupted footage, melted memory cards, no evidence of the nightmare. Just a few scratch marks on the RV's exterior, and those ashy smudges. I considered telling someone, maybe the local sheriff, about vandals in the forest. But who would believe me? I'd sound delirious. Stories like this rarely get a sympathetic ear. I could go back to Billy, tell him I believe his devil tale now. But what good would that do? I sipped my coffee, staring at the tables chipped for mica. I had survived something out there, something old and malignant playing with my mind. I recalled the ranger's warning, the strange scorched patches, Billy's grim legends. Not a coincidence, they knew. They all knew something lurked there. In the parking lot, I ran a hand over my RV's dented side, feeling the etched symbols. They resembled horns, twisted faces. Fear spiked again, but I pushed it down. I was safe now. At that thought, my mind drifted to my daughter. I realized I was still alive, given a second chance. Maybe I had to face that monster in the woods to understand how petty my pride was. Life was too short to let guilt and anger fester. I pulled out my phone, found a single bar of reception, and typed her number. My thumb hovered over the call button. Maybe not now, but soon. I promised myself I wouldn't run from my demons, inside or out. After leaving the diner, I drove north, away from Tate's Hell. The forests thinned, replaced by farmland and towns. I tried to rationalize the experience. Could it have been natural gas pockets causing hallucinations? A rogue group of pranksters? None of it made sense. But the memory of that sulfur smell and those burned hoof prints remained too vivid to dismiss. I kept driving, the RV engine humming steadily now. No flickers, no sabotage. As if the entity's influence vanished once I left its domain. Instead of relief, I felt a weary gratitude. I learned something important. Some places hold old powers, old legends that hunger for human fears. I was lucky to have escaped. In the days that followed, I updated my journal, noting every detail. I wouldn't publish these accounts. My wildlife footage project was a bust. No documentary this time, but I came away wiser. I vowed never to underestimate local legends, never to stride into unknown places with casual arrogance. At night, safe in a motel near Tallahassee, I dreamed of flickering red lights and hollow laughter, but they couldn't touch me now. I woke in a sweat, heart pounding, and told myself it was over. It would always linger in my mind, though. That sense of something out there, smiling in the dark, waiting for the next traveler to venture too deep, too unprepared, and too burdened with regret. Months have passed since that encounter. I've visited other parks, more carefully. I carry charms I never thought I'd need. A small piece of iron, a prayer whispered under my breath. Superstitious, maybe. But after what I saw, I'm not taking chances. As for my daughter, I did call her. We spoke haltingly, working toward understanding. Healing is slow, but it's a start. I'm done hiding from what haunts me, inside or out. So that's my story. I'm Jonas Parker, 52, a retired firefighter turned itinerant videographer who once entered Tate's Hell State Forest expecting to find birds and beasts to film. Instead, I discovered that some legends hold a kernel of truth. Whether it was the devil himself or a malevolent spirit of the wild, I'll never know. But I know this. I survived, and I learned that even the toughest of men can feel small and fragile in the face of ancient darkness. I don't plan to return to Tate's Hell. I can still smell sulfur when I recall those nights, still see the twisted shapes etched into my RV. Let others chase ghosts if they dare. Me, I've had my fill of hellish forests. I'll stick to safer trails and gentler lands, always remembering that place and the lessons it forced upon me. Some truths should remain buried in the shadows of old pines, where no one sane dares shine a light.